Creating a Republican Culture, 1790 to 1820. All right, the capitalist Commonwealth. Americans believed that republicanism should advance capitalism. So, in order to finance economic ventures, people needed banks to issue credits, to issue loans, to stabilize money. And so, cities such as Boston and New York founded banks, much like the Bank of the United States. In 1811, New York passed a law making it easier for businesses to incorporate and raise capital by selling shares of stock. Owners risked only the amount of money that they invested. These changes facilitated the raising of large sums of money necessary for building factories, canals, and railroads. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States, thus joining 246 other banks in the nation. The lack of regulations and laws made it easy for some banks to be less than trustworthy. The up and down capitalist business cycle was a new experience for Americans. Most just assumed that the economy would just grow and grow and grow, and they were not prepared for recessions and depressions. And then dubious banking policies and then a 30% drop in agriculture prices caused the panic of 1819, one of the first bank panics. In 1820, many small artisans were selling their products nationwide. Innovations in production and marketing, along with water-powered mills, increased output dramatically. Farmers changed their focus from subsistence crops to cash crops, such as potatoes, grains that they can sell overseas, and even livestock. The government sold off large areas of Western land at low prices, making these lands much more available. State banks are offering loans at low interest rates, once again making it easier to acquire these lands. All of these great economic changes, though, had a drastic effect on the environment. Foul production-induced smells are prominent in the factor areas in cities. They're cutting down trees to make room for these factories in these towns, which just leads to erosion problems. And then the mills that are built on these rivers with these giant water wheels to turn their turbines make it difficult for the fish to navigate the river, so either going up or down. So we find areas that no longer have fish in them. All right, new transportation systems make it easier for artisans and farmers to get their goods to markets and factories in the cities. Initially, goods were shipped via the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. However, with the advent of canals and railroads, new markets are opening up. States issued charters for turnpikes and canals, giving special rights to transportation routes to individuals and corporations. So people are going to own these rights to a section of the river or to a canal. Land near waterways becomes increasingly expensive, and speculators bought up land in cities with waterways such as Cincinnati, Louisville, Kentucky, Chattanooga, and St. Louis. Transportation charters also include the power of eminent domain, which means allowing the forced sale of private land along these routes. Eminent domain is in the news right now in Colorado because the Colorado Department of Transportation is expanding this huge I-70 project in Denver. And it's a large project, and homes and businesses that are close to I-70 along this route are being bought, or the government is taking them through eminent domain and paying them supposedly a fair market value. Well, that's great, but it still doesn't help if they're taking your home. You know, this is hard on people. And in the sense of the 1800s, they could be taking your land that you've been farming on for years. So people are losing their homes, even though they feel that this increased production and transportation is good for the Commonwealth, the public good, the idea of making America great. Critics argue that eminent domain gives too much power to corporations and it violates individual rights. The Supreme Court is going to uphold these laws because they are improving America. They are making things better for the public good. In 1790, the Lancaster Turnpike connected Philadelphia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Soon after, many privately owned toll roads were built. Toll roads were paid for by the people using them. By 1820, most of the country's major cities were connected by toll roads. There were no interstate roads at this time because state rights advocates would block federal funds for building these roads. They did not believe that the federal government had that much power to build highways all the way across the nation. The one exception was the Cumberland Road. The Cumberland Road was a paved highway and major route to the west, extending more than 1,000 miles from Maryland to Illinois. It was completed in the 1850s using both state and federal funds, with the different states receiving ownership of the different segments of the highway. The Erie Canal in New York was completed in 1825. The success of the canal stimulated economic growth and caused a fury of canal building, eventually connecting most of the waterways and lakes east of the Mississippi. Thanks to the canals connecting west to east, improved transportation meant lower food prices and more immigrants settling in the west, creating strong economic ties between the east and the west. In 1807, Robert Fullerton's steamboat, the Clermont, successfully navigated the Hudson River. Soon steamboats were operating round trip, shipping on the nation's great rivers, going both against the current and with the current, making the steamboat travel faster and cheaper. Railroads changed the face of the continent. The first railroads were completed in the 1820s. Early railroads suffered from safety problems, often resulting in accidents and deaths. And you can see from the photo that this first train is basically a bunch of stagecoaches hooked together on iron wheels. It doesn't look terribly safe. But eventually they get better. And by the end of the 1830s, railroads are competing with canals for carrying passengers and freight. And then the boom towns start to develop. Chicago, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Detroit. These new factory centers that can be linked via railroads to the East Coast. Following the Revolution and the development of a republic, there is a change in culture as ideas about families, womanhood, and children change to reflect republicanism. Debates over women's rights flow into the household as debates over who has authority within the home, the men or the women. Fewer parents are arranging marriages as their colonial ancestors had done, and children were choosing their own partners for love. The idea of sentimentalism, or the importance of feeling, the importance of appreciating God, nature, and fellow humans, led to what was known as companionate marriage. It's an important term to know. Marriage now celebrated the idea of falling in love, intimacy, and being helpmates, helpers to each other in life, the idea of being Republican. In reality, the husband remained the authoritarian leader of the home. After 1800, several states expand the legal grounds for divorce to include emotional turmoil, personal cruelty, or drunkenness. Men could still divorce for any reason they chose. Women do earn a little more appreciation as the country celebrates the idea of Republican motherhood. As more individuals choose their spouses, women are waiting longer to get married. Husbands and wives even choose to limit the size of their families. Part of this is a result of Republican ideology in general. Husbands and fathers are the family providers, which includes providing an inheritance. And in America, that would mean an inheritance for each child. Men feel the pressure to do so, and so their only option is to have fewer children, fewer people to provide for. After 1800, the birth rate actually declines. As stated earlier, women earn a little more respect as they take on greater responsibility for the welfare of the family. Women are helping in the fields, with livestock, completing piecework in the home, and now these Republican mothers are charged with educating their children and preparing their sons to be virtuous Republican citizens. So we have Republican marriage, Republican motherhood, and now we have to raise Republican children. Americans, unlike Europeans, divide their property equally among the children. Republican parents tend to be more permissive in offering their children choices, whereas European parents would have been much more strict. Yeoman farmers lean toward the European ideology of being strict, and mostly that is because they need to control their children. These children are their field hands, their workers, and they need to keep them close and under control. Choice, giving children choice, comes with affluence or money. So the more money you have, the easier it is to have choice. Whereas these yeoman farmers, these subsistence farmers, the lower class really need to keep their children under control, give them much less choice. Education becomes important during this time period because in order to be a good Republican and make wise decisions, children need to be educated. Most parents wanted their children to be able to read, write, and do basic sums. Artisans, laborers, and farmers needed the income their children could provide. So the more educated you are, the better job you're going to get, the more money you're going to make, same as today. Among the elite, higher education was encouraged, not just the basics of primary school, but through secondary school and even college. Until the 1820s, few children attended school on a regular basis, and after the 1820s, many state legislatures provide for public schools. Noah Webster said the nation's intellectual reputation would be raised by their education. Americans still look to Europe for literary works, music, art, and Webster is pushing Americans to create their own literary culture. Let's stop looking at Europe. Let's be proud Americans and let's produce our own culture here. Washington Irving is one of these first authors who becomes very popular with his story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson is gaining recognition for writing his book, The American Renaissance. All right, Republicanism and slavery. We need to backtrack a little bit to the Revolution because in 1776, slaves made up 1/3 of the population in the South. Some slaves believed the Revolution would end of slavery and therefore they would be freed, and those black loyalists, or blacks who supported the king, actually fled to Canada. Some free blacks volunteered to serve in the Continental Army, and others bargained service for freedom at the war's end. So if I fight, then I can be free at the end. In 1782, Virginia passed a Manumission Act, meaning owners were allowed to free their own slaves. Prior to this time, it would have been against the law to release your slaves. You don't want to make the other guys look bad. Some people still wanted their slaves. Some states offered gradual emancipation. Rather than free all the slaves at once, it was a gradual phasing out of slavery, such as determining that current slaves could earn their freedom at the age of 21, and anybody born during this time period would automatically be free. Phase it out slowly. Pennsylvania was the first state to pass a gradual emancipation law. Slavery is condemned by Quakers and Enlightenment thinkers. This ideology increased more after the war and the ratification of the Constitution, because many people actually believed the sentiments of the Declaration of Independence that all men were created equal actually applied to all men. In 1784, Massachusetts abolished slavery, and eventually all states north of Delaware had also abolished slavery by 1804. It is critical to note that even though the institution of slavery was illegal, discrimination still existed. Most whites did not want African Americans working with them or living near them or going to their church or eating at their restaurants. There were those Americans that defended the institution of slavery. First of all, slaves are considered property. They were a financial investment, and large plantation owners could have thousands of dollars invested in these slaves. In the South, slavery is considered a necessary evil. It is part of the economics now. It's almost impossible to undo slavery and still maintain the lifestyle that they were used to. White supremacy and the protection of the planter elite, this lifestyle has to be protected. It's part of the economics, same thing. And then Gabriel Prosser, a slave in Virginia, puts together a slave uprising. It failed. It resulted in Gabriel and 30 others being hanged. And it really fueled the fear, the fire, that slaves were less than human. They needed to be controlled, and gave the idea that republicanism was for whites only. Republicanism is for the elite. We see the beginnings of sectionalism. During the constitutional debates, the agreement was made that Congress not interfere in slavery, even though slavery was becoming a larger, growing national problem. Congress outlawed the slave trade in 1808, but slavery itself still exists. Visitors from Europe began to notice that there are distinct cultural differences between the North and the South. The South is very agricultural based, it is slave based. The North is more factory, manufacturing based. Obviously no slavery, but definitely still discrimination. These divides continue to grow wider in the coming years. There are anti-slave societies. They use Haiti as evidence that African Americans could overthrow the institution of slavery, and Black abolitionists began to speak out. They began to take their ideologies public. Blacks would join secret anti-slave societies, hoping to free themselves, their families, to end the institution of slavery. The American Colonization Society is an anti-slave society that was founded by whites, and it's seeking to free the slaves, but it wants to return them to Africa. Abraham Lincoln even believed this was a good idea. So approximately 6,000 African Americans resettle in Liberia, a country on the western coast of Africa at the time. Most Blacks are against this idea because they believe themselves to be Americans now. Most of them have been born in the United States. After the cotton boom of the 1800s, the demand for slavery only increases. Things are going to get worse. This is a great map of the slave states, the status of slavery basically in 1800. You can see which territories are free, which territories have gradual abolition, which territories are slave. And of course, with the Missouri Compromise, this all changes even more. And we're going to talk about that next. Okay, Republicanism and slavery, the Missouri Crisis, 1819 to 1821, constitutional questions, and then the Compromise to try to calm things down for a couple of years. Basically, in 1819, Missouri is ready to enter the Union as a state. It has met all of the requirements put forth in the Northwest Ordinances, and they are ready to go. The question is, will they come in as a free state or a slave state? And the debate becomes very, very heated. Congressmen from the North are going to block Missouri's attempts to come in as a slave state. And So congressmen from the South say, fine, we just won't let Maine come in as a free state. And you just get this back and forth going on. And the Southerners have some pretty good arguments. They're going to argue that when a slave enters the Union, they come in as a state with all of the rights of a state. There's no waiting period to earn any of these rights. You come in as equals to all the other states. And then equality means that you get to choose whether you are going to be a free or a slave state. And this is constitutional. The Constitution guarantees state sovereignty, that you have the right to decide for yourselves. And it also says that Congress does not have the authority to infringe on the property rights of citizens within these states. And slaves are considered property. So what are we going to do? Well, 2 years of debate, because prior to this time, there were 22 states equally divided, 11 slave, 11 free, and now there's this big problem. So Henry Clay eventually comes up with a plan, and his plan is what we call the Missouri Compromise. And it says that Maine will come in as a free state in 1820. Missouri will be admitted as a slave state in 1821. They're going to draw a line across the Louisiana Territory at the 3630 line. And basically, this is the dividing line. Anything north of this will be a free state. Anything south will be slave states, Missouri being the exception. This is going to create a precedent for all new states entering the Union. And then the question is, well, do they need to come in as pairs, one free, one slave? How is this going to work? And then all of this territory across the United States, what is the area that you see is New Spain on the map, well, eventually that's going to become American territory. Which territory has more space, the North or the South? And this all goes back to representation in Congress. Who is going to have the most representatives, the slave states or the free states? Okay, Republican Christianity and these ideas of religious freedom, how they're going to deal with church and state, these new church institutions, and a little bit about the Second Great Awakening. First of all, prior to the Revolution, most states and colonies had religious taxes, and that's how they paid for the churches. So there would be one main church in the state, and that church would receive tax monies to continue to work. After the Revolution, there's going to be more debates about this idea of religious tolerance. There's many more denominations in each state. Well, which one do you decide would be the state religion? And it's decided in the Constitution that there will be no state religion, even though that really applies to the federal government. And that's something we can talk about a little bit later also. So there's no more religious taxes in the states per their constitutions, although Congregationalism does remain the official church in New England until the 1830s. And remember, New England is this hotbed of federalism, and their early threats to secede because they were unhappy with the way the United States was handling the French Revolution. They were unhappy with the way the United States is dealing with the Barbary pirates and with Jay's Treaty. So they threatened to secede over and over and over again. And this is where Aaron Burr and Hamilton get in their tiff and eventually end up dueling because of their disagreements about this. All right, church and state politics or relations. Basically, Virginia is going to prohibit religious qualifications for holding office, which means other states must have had religious qualifications for holding office. Some states actually will disqualify you for holding office if you're Jewish or Catholic. So you would want to be a good Protestant Christian to hold office, meaning you would need to be Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, one of those types of religions. We don't even have a Catholic president until the 1960s, with John F. Kennedy being our first president. And the fear being that a Catholic would answer to the Pope before he would answer to his people, his constituents, his country. Enlightenment thinkers are going to encourage the idea of volunteerism. So how are we going to pay for these churches? Well, through volunteerism or funding through the church membership, which was what we do today. You join a church, you become a member, and you pay for the workings of that church through tithing, which is usually 10% of your annual income is what you should be giving to the church. These new church institutions have Republican ideologies at their core, and they're going to have spiritual equality, right? The idea of republicanism, the idea of equality. They are governed democratically, which means they have a voting body of the church membership that is going to make all the decisions for the church. And people are going to avoid those churches with hierarchical, authoritarian ideologies, such as Catholicism, because they are going to answer to the Pope. The Presbyterian Church becomes very popular. Those among the Americans that are unchurched or not affiliated with any churches are attracted to these evangelical churches, these new churches, the Methodists and the Baptists. They are very dynamic and new, and people flock to them. So the Second Great Awakening, like I said, we're just going to touch on this. As I stated, the Methodist and Baptist churches are gaining popularity, and a lot of it is based on their preachings, their teachings. They're going to use the techniques that had been learned in the First Great Awakening and this reaching out to every man, this Republican equality, that religion is for everybody. And in the South, these evangelical churches are going to not only preach spiritual equality, but they're going to speak out and criticize slavery. Well, of course, that's not going to make the Southern white planters very happy, and they begin to leave the church. So in order to retain membership, the churches are going to change their teachings and actually find a way to make slavery biblical. They see that, in the Bible there were slaves there, and they use verses from the Bible where God says slavery is okay. And so they're supporting their white supremacy. Other planters are going to allow other white planters are going to encourage Christianity among their slaves, and the slaves are going to take their form of religion and have it meet their needs, and they are going to develop this unique relationship with God, and they're going to embrace the teaching of Moses and the slaves that were under the control of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the idea of God coming and setting those slaves free. The reform within the church is that ministers are now going to preach the idea of salvation through good works, these benevolent ideologies. So you do good for others and you can save your soul. And this leads to a rise in these benevolent societies, humane societies. They're going to work together to help the less fortunate within the community. And women find a place where they can participate outside the home now in this acceptable public forum, working for charity for the community. Congregations stop separating men and women in their prayer services, and they're going to encourage men and women to pray together now, to work together. And they're even going to say that there are fewer pregnancies outside of marriage, because people are learning that they can, or men and women are learning that they can pray together and be together and not have this lust take over. All this newfound freedom for women sparks a panic in men, and so they're going to use the church to kind of rein the women in just a little bit. And most women are denied the right to vote within the church, even though they may be the majority in the membership. They cannot vote as the men would within the church. A lot of the sermons focus on reminding the women that they are wives and mothers first, and that is their duty. Church-sponsored schools, though, are going to encourage young girls to go to school. And it's these young girls being taught in these church schools that then become the teachers in the 1820s when the states start encouraging state-sponsored education. These are all early steps in the women's rights movement.